Hey, what's going on, guys? Today we're going to be covering the type chart in Cassette Beasts. Now, Cassette Beasts is a recently revealed monster battler that focuses on 2v2 battles, fusions, branched evolution, and open world, and something called elemental chemistry. Elemental chemistry is this game's equivalent to the type chart. Now, this type chart being dubbed chemistry isn't just a fancy way to reference the usual damage multipliers we see in Pokemon or Temtem. It's actually extremely more complex and allows for a simple yet difficult to master system focusing on buffs, debuffs, and even transmutation. It's really interesting and an amazing idea. I'm surprised more games haven't already incorporated this. So I hope you'll sit back, relax, and get ready for some funky type matchups. So at a first glance, we could see Cassette Beasts features some really interesting typings. There are 14 types in total, and the list reads as follows: Beast, Fire, Plastic, Plant, Water, Poison, Ice, Lightning, Air, Earth, Metal, Glass, Glitter, and Astral. Now keep in mind that there are also typeless attacks that have no additional effects. So I figured the best course of action would be to explain how exactly this type chart works, talk about confirmed reactions between certain types, and then theorize on exactly what will happen when the two types interact. For example, what a type might transform into, or what kind of buff or debuff will apply. Now, regarding how this type chart works, basically the horizontal rows are the attacking types, while the vertical columns are the defending types. For example, this yellow mark represents what happens when fire attacks plastic. There are 4 different colors for effects, white being no extra effect, green being the defender getting a buff, the red indicates the defender getting a debuff, and yellow indicates the defender changing types. So basically green's gonna sort of be your not very effective, red will be your super effective, but keep in mind, like I said, there's no damage multipliers. You'll hit for the same damage, but if it's red, you'll end up causing some sort of additional effect that's negative towards your opponent, and if it's green, you'll cause an effect that's positive towards your opponent. In terms of known effects, we have a couple. So when fire types attack water types, it causes the water type to gain a shroud of steam, which heals it over time. Conversely, if you attack a fire type with a water type, it extinguishes the fire type's flames, which lowers its melee and ranged attack stats. Melee and ranged being like attack and special attack. We also know that if you use a fire attack on a plastic type, it melts the plastic, turning it into a poison type. As you can see, all of these matchups are based in reality. If you heat up water, you get steam. If you pour water on fire, it extinguishes it. If you use fire on plastic, it melts it, creating poisonous fumes. Now, in this little blurb here, we're given insight on how the entire glitter type works. There are no natural glitter types. Instead, there are moves called Glitter Bomb, which turn into glitter type, and if you're a glitter type and you get hit with another attack, you become the attack you were just hit with. The website states to think about it what happens when you start throwing glitter around. It gets everywhere. So with that being said, I just want to reiterate, basically the type chart works with buffs, debuffs, and transmutations. There's no damage multipliers. Each type's going to affect each other type in a way that's unique. So with that being said, now we're going to move into the sort of speculative aspect of this video where we go over how each type interacts with each other, the potential reason why, and sort of my off-the-cuff idea as to what debuff, buff, or transmutation could occur as a result. Now with the type chart here, we're going to go down the list via who's attacking one by one, and doing such will also give us the defending interactions as well. Keep in mind that the interactions are subject to change as balancing comes into account over time. So first up's the Beast type, which in and of itself is a noteworthy concept, as it'll be interesting to see what sort of monsters come out of it. Beast is advantageous over Glass, giving it a debuff, and that little black dot represents a field hazard. Think of Beast versus Glass like the old saying about the bull in the china shop. The field hazard is due to the idea that when glass shatters, it gets everywhere, thus perhaps causing some sort of effect, maybe similar to spikes. There's not too much info on that front, but I'm interested to see what comes out of it. Beast type doesn't hit anything else for a special effect other than glitter, but like I said, glitter's effect is going to be the same for everything, so we're not really going to keep mentioning it because it's redundant. Next up's going to be fire type, and we already know the transmutation effect it has with plastics, transforming them into poison types. As for its other effects, it's advantageous against plant and metal. Now, fire beats plant for obvious reasons, and the debuff that could apply could be something like a burn effect where the plant loses health each turn as it's slowly being burned away with the fire. Sort of like what happens when a wooden house starts to burn down. As this fire spreads, you know, it's not all at once, but over time, it slowly engulfs the entire house. Basically, I could see it acting like a fire spin of sorts. It would also be a good contrast to what happens when fire hits steam, healing the opponent, so it would kind of be like you get opposite effects based on what you do. As for metal, fire was used historically to reshape metal into various forms. Depending on how they handle the metal type, they could be like, we could have some robots or literal metal beings. I could see the debuff also causing overheating if we are going the sort of robot route, where perhaps the metal type gets overheated and causes speed reduction oxygen or something to that extent. Think about what happens when your electronic overheats. It starts to be really slow. And even if the metal types are less digital based and more just like physical metal based, I could still see the speed stat going down as the metal's melting. Like stated previously, fire will buff water types, giving them a steam bonus, which heals them by a small amount each turn. Now, it's also buffing astral type, and I believe that comes from the fact that fire can't exist in space as it needs oxygen. As for what kind of buff we could see, I'm kind of stumped a little bit, because if the fire does dissipate due to lack of oxygen per se, it simply no longer exists. So I see how astral could hurt fire, but not how it could be buffed. If you guys have any ideas, please feel free to let me know in the comments. As for transmutation effects, we already know about the plastic becoming poison, but what's interesting is we also have ice that transmutates, and I think it's pretty obvious it's going to become water because fire melts ice. Next up is plastic, and it's advantageous against water and electric. Now for water, I think this sort of is referring to how plastic pollutes the ocean over time. So as for a debuff, I could see water types slowly being corrupted, perhaps reducing damage from water attacks. And for electricity, plastic is not a very good conductor, so I could see electric types receiving a debuff akin to perhaps electric type attacks straight up don't work for a turn or two. But I'm not too sure if that'll be broken for balancing purposes, but I see the electric not being able to move freely because of the plastic. Plastic buffs fire types due to the fact that when plastic burns, it creates toxic fumes. An interesting buff could be that perhaps the fire type hit could get a temporary poison secondary effect to their fire type move. So, you hit them with, I don't know, fire blast, and then as a secondary effect, the opponent becomes poisoned for a couple turns. That'd be a pretty cool buff to add to the fire type. Next up's plant types, and they're advantageous to water, electricity, and earth. These are pretty well standard for the monster tamer genre. Plant absorbs water. Plants make a bad insulator, especially trees. And plants could literally break through stones over time. A good debuff for water could be a sapping effect akin to Leech Seed, where the water type gets its HP drained. Or perhaps sort of like plastic, where it's not a good conductor, it can reduce speed. And against earth, perhaps a debuff where the earth has its defense stats lowered as sort of representing the plant emerging from the ground or cracking the earth beneath it. As for buffs, a plant is going to buff fire, poison, air, and ice. So for fire, perhaps the plant acts as a sort of combustible material, making the fire larger, granting a higher attack, and sort of a foil as to what happens when water hits it, decreasing its stats. To poison, I guess the poison would spread through the plant, perhaps buffing the poison type's attacks as it's spreading. For ice, I could see like a frost effect where the ice type gains a defensive boost or something to that extent while it sticks to the frozen plant. And for air, I mean, just think about what happens when trees and plants start getting mixed into a tornado. It could grant it some extra damage power. I mean, I could also see air types getting a buff where the user that attacks gets sort of like a bleed effect on their foe after attacking, because like the sticks and stuff that sort of become part of the tornado. But I don't think they're going to add bleed per se, but they could have another system that functions similarly. Like Coromon has a cut type, so it could be something like that, and then you get residual damage after because you get cut by all the sticks and stuff. I don't know, just a thought. Now, water types are advantageous against fire, which we already know creates an extinguishing effect, which lowers the fire type's attacking stats, and it's also advantageous against earth and metal. For earth, water causes corrosion. I could see a similar debuff to what I mentioned for plant. The corrosion could lower the defensive stats. And for metal, water causes metal to rust. So again, I could see a defensive sort of debuff there. I mean, rusty metal ain't that strong. As for buff effects, water buffs the following types: plastic, plant, and electric. For plastic, we explained the pollution thing. Perhaps the plastic types will gain sort of like a defensive buff against water's weaknesses. So basically maybe fire won't be able to transmutate it now because it's wet, it's got a water coating. I don't know, something to that extent. For plant, I could definitely see a healing factor like I mentioned with the vice versa matchup. And with lightning, water's a great conductor, so I could see lightning types gaining a huge speed buff as if though it can move freely through the water. So next up's poison type, and it's advantageous against plant due to obvious reasons of pesticides, and oddly enough, it's advantageous against astral, which astral is the cosmic or paranormal type, so it's interesting that poison beats it. My guess is that astral is sort of like an extension of what we'd consider to be like a psychic type or a fairy type in Pokemon, and with that we can kind of understand the idea of poisoning the mind, or the fact that the body kind of shuts down when it's injected with poison, sort of screwing up the synapses. And then with the fairy thing, poison's generally used as like a plot device to screw over the main protagonists, like for example the poisonous apple and such. I could be wrong on this, but let me know your thoughts down below. How does poison beat astral? In terms of debuffs, I could see the plant types being poisoned and thus experiencing whittling damage, and same goes for cosmic types because I don't really know what else cosmic types would do. I see poison functioning in that way. It's not so great against earth and metal, buffing them for obvious reasons. You can't poison a rock or a mineral. In terms of buffs, metal could receive a cool buff that sort of relates to poison-tipped weapons. Perhaps it could gain the poison status whenever it's using metal type attacks, sort of like what I mentioned earlier, with fire gaining a poison sort of thing with plastics. And for earth, I could perhaps see the opposite with it doing the same thing but on the defensive side. So if someone makes contact with you, they get poisoned because like sort of the earth is just covered in poison. The ice type is advantageous against plants because, you know, plants don't usually like extreme temperatures. Air, I'm assuming this is because birds and other flying creatures don't fare well in icy conditions. Earth, due to the soil and such being frozen over, as well as, you know, snow kind of taken over. And glass, because of the fact that if the temperatures are cold enough, glass can actually be shattered, and, you know, icy windshields kind of suck too. In terms of debuffs, I could honestly see plant, earth, and air receiving some sort of frozen debuff like in Pokemon, just perhaps less broken, because getting frozen every time you take damage would kind of suck. So perhaps they can have like a freeze effect where your speed gets reduced, or maybe it could be like RNG based and there's a chance that you won't be able to attack because you're frozen. Something like that. As for glass, like we mentioned earlier, it has this little dot in the middle which indicates a field hazard. So in other words, glass's debuffs seem to be all the same, perhaps creating a spikes-like effect like I mentioned earlier. Ice is disadvantageous only to metal, which is interesting because metal can get icy and sort of even freeze over, but perhaps this is due to the metal just getting a sort of like a icy coat. I mean, licking a pole in the cold ain't fun. The pole ends up being fine, but your tongue isn't. For buffs, perhaps metal can gain a buff that protects it from fire type attacks for one turn because the ice would sort of transmutate into water, thus extinguishing the fire. I don't know, just a thought. This one's a little more up in the air. Ice also has a transmutation effect where it transforms water, likely into ice as well for obvious reasons. Next up's lightning type, and it's advantageous against water, air, and metal. Water and metal due to them being excellent conductors, and as for air, we mentioned earlier with flying creatures not liking lightning so much, and, you know, lightning storms aren't nice. In terms of debuffs, I could see a sort of shock effect on the water type where they either become slower or lose defense as they're vulnerable. For air, I could actually see them being grounded by the lightning, perhaps losing their stab if stab ends up being a thing in Cassette Beasts. And for metal, I could see them perhaps having a status where they hurt their teammate slowly over time with damage, as being near metal while it's conducting electricity is quite dangerous. I don't know, that's just sort of a thought, or perhaps it could be like a shock effect that affects both you and your teammate. It's going to be disadvantageous against plastic, as I'm assuming plastic may incorporate some rubber-esque aspects, as synthetic rubber has plastic inside it and they're sort of similar in composition, and electricity doesn't do anything to that. In terms of a buff, it's hard to say. It's easy to say why it would get a buff, but besides doing nothing, I don't really see what positive effect can be attributed to having electricity hit plastic. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. Now, lightning actually transmutates earth, which is interesting to say the least. Now, looking through the various types, there doesn't seem to be anything that straight up screams earth turns into this. However, I could see it transforming into perhaps fire, as when lightning strikes, fire tends to follow, though that would be more towards plant, as generally the fires are from hitting trees and whatnot, but I don't really see another viable option here. Perhaps I'm just dumb. Air is going to be advantageous against plant due to, like I said earlier, hurricanes tend to destroy plant life. And strange here is that it's also advantageous against glass, but does not cause the field hazard. My guess is that the hurricane kind of comes, shatters the glass, and then blows it away, so it's not an issue. In terms of the debuffs, plants could perhaps lose the ability to sap, if that's a thing. For example, since the plants were kind of unrooted, moves that would be equivalent to, let's say, leech seed shouldn't work as a plant is not in the ground anymore. As for glass, this debuff wouldn't be a field hazard, so perhaps instead glass types could like lose stab bonus while they're shattered or something to that extent. It's disadvantageous against lightning for the same reason we discussed about the vice versa, and metal, I mean, likely just due to the fact that metal is super heavy. In terms of buffs, I could perhaps see lightning types gaining a ranged attack bonus, as coupled with air it would create like a storm, and metal perhaps could gain something akin to like a wind tunnel where its attacks also get buffed. Earth is advantageous against fire, plastic, lightning, and metal. For fire, soil can be used to put out fire. For lightning, we already talked about grounding. For metal, well, just look at what an earthquake did to this bridge. And plastic is a bit of an oddity in my opinion. Plastic ruins the earth, so I don't know why it swapped around. In terms of debuffs, I could see fire getting the same debuff as when hit by water, lowering both of its attack stats due to it being extinguished. For lightning, getting grounded could perhaps face a similar fate to fire. Metal could perhaps see a debuff to defense because it's collapsed. And for plastic, like I said, I'm not even sure why it gets a debuff, so let me know what your take is on that. Earth is disadvantageous towards plant as well as air, which for plants, they kind of grow out of the earth, so that's probably why on that front they sort of take life from the earth in order to sprout. And for air, well, try hitting a bird with an earthquake, it doesn't quite work. Now in terms of buffs, I could see the plants gaining some sort of regenerate, and in terms of air, I'm not really sure because I understand how earth can not hit something in the air, but I don't know how the air would get buffed by the earthquake going off and missing. So that's going to be another one where I'm going to kind of ask you guys what you guys think about that. Now metal is rather interesting. It's advantageous against ice, which we explained earlier. Glass, likely due to, you know, if you throw a piece of metal at glass, it's probably going to break. And oddly enough, it debuffs earth. So earth and metal are sort of advantageous against each other and disadvantageous against each other. For earth, it could be perhaps due to the fact that metals are created from the earth, or maybe that despite how many earthquakes we have, these metal structures are always being built and sort of blocking the earth from growing plants and whatnot because, you know, you got all these metal structures on top of it. In terms of debuffs, perhaps metal shatters ice, causing ice types to be unable to attack or something to that effect. I'm not quite sure. With glass, we know it's going to be a field hazard due to the asterisks. And for earth, perhaps earth types could receive some sort of slowdown as the metal would weigh it down or something to that extent. It does end up buffing lightning types due to it being a conductor, and I could see lightning getting a physical attack increase as it could use the metal as sort of like a blunt force alongside its lightning attacks. Now, metal actually causes a transmutation effect on plastic type, which at first glance seems odd, but after I did a little bit of using the old Google, I think I may have an idea of what kind of transmutation we could see. So apparently when metal is melted together with plastic, it can create various chemical compounds such as carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and even dihydrogen monoxide, aka water. So with that being said, I see three possibilities for this transmutation. We can either get water as mentioned, air, as although the three formerly mentioned compounds aren't pure oxygen per se, at least the first two are gases containing oxygen. And the final type I could see it becoming is poison because carbon monoxide can kill you if you breathe enough of it. Glass types are advantageous against lightning types as mirrors reflect the light, and as for debuff, I could see lightning damaging itself or its allies as a result of sort of hitting the glass and then bouncing back. That could end up being broken though, so I don't really know how they might balance that out. It doesn't actually buff any type, meaning that essentially you don't really have to worry about what you hit with a glass type attack. It does, however, transmutate once again plastic, which for this one, the only thing I could find is that sometimes glass is infused with plastic. So maybe glass hitting plastic just turns a plastic type also into a glass type? Now, our final type other than glitter, because we already mentioned that, is astral, arguably the most ambiguous typing. It's only advantageous against poison, which if you remember correctly, poison was also good against it. So now I'm really confused. If we go back to astral sort of being linked to the mind and, you know, poison kind of shutting down the mind, like I said, perhaps the logic here is that if you're smart enough, you won't take the poison. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, but I don't freaking know. I honestly don't know what possible debuff poison could get here. Perhaps a debuff where the poison attack like sort of misses or something. It doesn't make sense. If you didn't ingest it, I guess that could be an option, but again, astral and poison are two types that I'm really confused about how their interactions work. It actually seems to be kind of a crappy type because it's disadvantageous against a few types, being plant, water, and astral itself. So astral buffing other astral types, I could see perhaps like space and space equals more space. A buff could perhaps involve boosting evasion or something because there's more space and therefore you're more likely to miss. As for water and plant, seeing as astral is defined, and this is according to the website, as their paranormal / cosmic sort of type, perhaps the idea here is that astral typing invigorates the water or the plant with cosmic energy, enhancing its abilities as water and plants are sort of the foundation of life itself. This last type is a little up in the air, so my apologies for that. But yeah, that's the entire type chart in a nutshell. A very large nutshell. Literally, the script for this video ended up being over 3,700 words. I was not expecting that going into it. The elemental chemistry system is extremely interesting, and from what I've seen from you guys as well as the general Monster Tamer community is that it's one of the many factors that's driving people towards this game. I think Cassette Beasts will end up being a very successful game that will sort of challenge the Monster Tamer subgenre overall. I look forward to continuing to make content about this game. I have videos planned going over the monsters, the unknown monsters, the fusions, even the bond system, etc. Now with all that being said, if you did enjoy the video, please make sure to like. I put a lot of work into this one especially. And if you're looking forward to any of those videos I mentioned, make sure to subscribe so you get notified when they come out. And if you haven't already, join our subscriber Discord. We're running out of founder spots. And until next time, peace.